Hi everyone, and welcome to the Real Talk podcast, hosted by me, Daizy Gedeon. As an award-winning journalist and filmmaker with more than 4 decades of experience globally, but now based in apparently one of the most dangerous cities in the world, Beirut, I decided that the perception of the world was wrong about Lebanon and Beirut, and took it upon myself to prove that fact by introducing you to real people with real stories through my Real Talk podcast. So expect to be surprised, illuminated, entertained and educated about Lebanon and the Middle East through this series. Every episode will take you on a journey into the homes, heartland and highlights of a diverse range of people, from locals to foreigners and artists to activists, and unearth the timeless secrets and stifling syndromes that keep this once jewel of the Middle East paralysed, whilst at the same time untamed and unashamed. So thank you for joining me, and 1,000 blessings to those who also support me through your generous donations. It is only through the assistance of people like you, who expect the media to provide a level playing field, an unbiased discourse, a free and fair point of view, that my team and I are able to continue to seek the truth, produce these reports and share them with you. So click on the donate button below and send whatever you can afford to help keep those stories coming. And please remember to follow me on YouTube by hitting the subscribe button and all my social media platforms. And if you like the podcast, then please tell your friends about Real Talk or share the link. Wouldn't the world be an amazing place if we all amused ourselves with more of the truth and less of the propaganda? I think so. Thank you for your faith and support. Today we're in the home of Ronnie Chatah. I hope I've got that right.
Very close. Very close. Chatah.
Chatah. Yeah, this is why I need to learn Arabic properly. Then I know how to accentuate the elements of the word. But a pleasure to be with you, Ronnie.
It's an honor.
We've heard and crossed paths, as we were talking about, several times in the last 7-8 years, but never had the chance to sit down and talk. And the tables have turned on you today.
That's true.
Normally you're asking the questions, and tonight I'm going to be doing that. But thank you for letting us into your home. Great to be in the environment of the person that we're interviewing, so that people can really get a feel for that person beyond the words.
It is a pleasure, and I will say 2 things. Even though this country is small and we usually run into each other just by default, it is quite extraordinary that we've never actually spoken to each other.
Yes.
Now that's maybe a good thing, because I think both of us like to keep the conversation fresh.
Yeah.
So we're finally talking 6-7 years after we first interacted somehow.
That's right.
I've been looking forward to this.
Great. Thank you very much. It's my pleasure, honestly. And I know we might, touch on some subjects that we disagree on, but that's part of the learning process, You never learn from people you already agree with. It's understanding a different perspective from a completely different background. That's the beauty of meeting people that, do have alternative viewpoints. So let's get to know who Ronnie Chatah is.
It's interesting. I get asked this question a lot, and I do struggle sometimes to find a short answer. And I think if I found a word that best sums it up, it's a word that I think I've heard you refer to yourself as, which is a storyteller. Now, it's hard to make a financial income sustainable off of storytelling.
Sure.
And it's harder to be independent. Somehow, I've managed to do that in my limited space, which is, I think, shared with you, in that there's a dance between local and diaspora audience. I made a decision long ago to never let go of this place.
So now you're based here then, permanently?
I haven't traveled in a long time, almost 4 or 5 years now. I haven't left the country. But in those years in between, it was studying here, studying abroad, living here, living abroad, working here, working abroad. But majority of the time was here.
Well, it's a great place to actually live.
Yeah.
And it would be just truly, Jannah
if there was some order to the chaos and rights, for the people. I mean, with all of what Lebanon's going through, you still don't see petty crime and chaos on the level that you would see in other countries. There's still something that binds the people together to their culture, to their values, they've been brought up very good values. I've just met so many people recently who've just come to Lebanon and just said, this is a fantastic place.
Yep.
Love this place. Love the people.
I worry that they were saying this in 1985 too.
Yeah.
I think there's something that's never changed, which is the visitor loves the country as it is. The native maybe loves it because it's in their DNA, despite the disaster. Even in times of war, visitors still had it. They enjoy it here.
But even before the war, though, the heyday of Lebanon was the 60s and early 70s. That was when it was the place to be. The French Riviera, you had all the movie stars and royalty and everyone, parking their yachts outside the St. George. Actors like Omar Sharif, Peter O'Toole and Bridget Bardot and David Niven, doing research for my first film. All of the stars that just were here, even going to Pepe's and Byblos and seeing all the photographs of all the stars that have been to Lebanon. It's a tragedy that we're here today. It's still a much loved country, but
Absolutely.
There's a lot to overcome before we had to learn. I think the biggest thing is that there's a huge lesson, and I don't think we've learned it yet, unfortunately, which is why we're still here today. But let's move on, because we're not going to get into too much of that politics. Just to, again,
we'll
get into it through the conversation. You've got the Beirut Banyan, your podcast, love it. You've done the MTV podcast. You write, you do tours, the walking tours. And they were something you started with when you first came back, that walk tours of Beirut?
I'll try to not bore you too much by going a bit back in time. I think my curiosity with everything that's happened in recent memory goes back to a unique point, and that's February to March 2005. There's a few weeks there that shaped my political identity without me knowing it. And I think the first person that I didn't know, at least I had only crossed paths and never spoken to in person, but crossed paths in the right places at the right time, that was Samir Asir, who's somebody who's the average guy. Average meaning he's one of us. He's a cosmopolitan thinker, writer. He's probably much smarter than me, and I can't claim any authority he had.
It's amazing, man.
But he found a way to, I think, inspire students and to appreciate their history more. He took journalism to the street, which is not easy to do. He was comfortable, I think, most comfortable in Beirut as it is. So he could speak in French in Hamra, speak in Arabic in Ashrafiyeh. I don't know if he spoke English that well, but he could do the unthinkable, which is bridge the divide with ease, meaning he would write in An-Nahar with Arab leftist ideas, and he would also speak about sovereignty and independence in a way that's unusual for a traditional left-wing figure in Lebanese history. He had a gift, and that gift also was his charisma, and it helps that maybe he was very young. And when he died in June 2005, I decided without realizing it that I would pay tribute to someone like him. That's the Walk Beirut tour I used to give. It was a 4-hour dedication to storytellers, ending with Samir Asir. It didn't go further. And that's something I started doing in 2006, maybe 2 weeks before the war started, July 2006. That's 18 years ago. A few years later, I guess it's 2009, or my memory's off. Maybe it's 2009, that newspapers, international press, started thinking of Beirut as a #1 tourism destination. I think it's the New York Times in 2010 that even put it as the top tourism destination that summer. I was lucky that I was already giving those tours. A lot of press coverage happened because I think I was the only person doing this. meaning taking groups of people in a way that's not tour guide, like storytelling on the streets of Beirut and mixed with Lebanese and foreigners and diaspora and whatever. Students from schools, university professors would join me. I used to start at the banyan tree of AUB, which is just at the intersection of Bliss and AUB's old medical gate. I would start the tour there, sharing stories of, in a way, of the birth pangs of modern Lebanon and how Daniel Bliss found himself bestowing a university that's world-renowned now, talking about an era of Ottoman reform in the 1860s, 1870s, and trying to bring a semblance of life that's unusual. I wasn't trying to do tourism. I was trying to pay tribute. And it used to end at Samir.
Well, the spirit, you're trying to find the real spirit of this country, and it's not found in its sights.
100%. And stories of the Holiday Inn were more interesting to me than...
definitely.
I started doing the tour when there was still a Lebanese Jewish woman living in the old Jewish quarter of Beirut, in Wadi Abu Jnir. So before it was locked up, we'd go into the synagogue, we'd go to her home next door. I think every single Lebanese person that joined the tour had no idea before that just a few decades earlier, there was a Jewish quarter in Beirut.
Yes.
And I would end it with Samir Asir at his statue in downtown. But I kept doing the tour until 2019. And it would still deliberately end in 2005. That was the marker for me. Don't go beyond that because the story is developing.
That's the walk, and then your podcasts, your interviews, your articles. You've interviewed such a broad range of people, and it's
missing you though.
Yeah, that's maybe okay.
Now we're doing
it was meant to be the other way around.
Exactly.
One day, you're very welcome. I'm very happy to sit down and talk. But there's such a whole gamut of professions and interests that you came across, and I think watching your podcasts and the energy in those interviews is really engaging because they're so natural and real, and people just feel like you can tell that the truth is just coming out and their frustrations or their opinions. But it's great that you're able to connect with those people and be able to sit down and have those conversations and continue that, and that's what you're largely doing right now, right?
I do consultancies to make ends meet, but actually, funny enough, they've become media focused too. So they're in the same space, except that I'm not the host. I'm not choosing the guests. But that's really making ends meet. But the podcast, it's interesting. At times of crisis, it makes money. Donations driven. There's no sponsor, and when there's tragedy, unfortunately, the curiosity goes up. And there's more listeners than viewers. With your permission, I'll go back to what I was trying to do with the podcast rather than what it became. I wanted to take the tour and make it more, because you can only share so much of a city's history in an afternoon, evening by foot. There were other things I was deeply curious about that couldn't be discussed on the tour because they wouldn't make sense. So then I decided to go to one of my favorite storytellers, and I introduced myself to him, Ziad Daizy, who did West Beirut and The Insult.
Great director.
In my opinion, I don't care what people say about him when he's in trouble here, maybe he gets detained for a few hours. None of that matters to me. What matters is I think he's the most gifted Lebanese filmmaker of all time. And he's only left a few Lebanese movies, but they're both perfect.
Great. Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, I think he's a master of also narrative, and he can tell two stories at once. West Beirut and East Beirut. The Insult is largely the East Beirut story. I wanted to go to him, and I got his number, and he reminded me he's not here. He's in Paris. So I went to Paris, and I recorded the first episode with him in his studio with these two mics, actually. And I was a complete amateur, didn't know what I was doing, But I felt at ease talking to him because I think I felt that I'm with someone who's also in love and injured by the same story, except he's taken it to movies. And I immediately knew this is something I'd like to do again and again and again. And I avoided politics at the beginning. It was mostly art and history. The second episode was about the train system, the defunct train system.
The train lines.
The train and the tram and the rail.
Yes, the rail system.
I found a guy who used to run an NGO called Train. It's a very
Great name.
Great name. Yeah, what is it about? Trains. And he was the last activist, let's say, to try to actually operate one of the trains. And he took one of the train conductors, who I think has since passed away, into one of the parked trains in Fidenshebek, which are still there.
Still there.
He got the battery, he operated them, and they started moving the train in Fidenshebek, and they got arrested.
Wow.
So they were caught playing with the train. But this is a train from the Civil War.
Wow.
And it's a train that was used in the 1990s. And I remembered this train because it used to go from Dawra to Jbel. And I actually, just above the guest in the back, there's a photo. I have this photo of the train in the 1990s. Something I knew nothing about. Why was there a train operating post-Civil War? And why doesn't anyone even really think about that there's no public transport? Or think about it in a way that's policy oriented. And I was fascinated, and I was naive a bit. And I said, you know what, that could be the second episode. From Ziad Douairi to, his name was Ilyas Malouf. So that was the terrain you can't do on a tour. So I kept doing that.
Love it.
It ended up even with Roderick Surso, talking about the aristocrats of Ashrafiyya. But then October 17 happened, and I happened to be at the right place at the right time with a co-host who wanted to go to the street and live in Martyrs Square with a microphone, and she did. For 1 month, she recorded episodes every day, and the conversations went from trains and movies and Surso to suddenly became about protests, expectations, accountability, reform, things that I remember from 2005, except going maybe in some ways deeper, and in some ways perhaps without realizing it, and no one I think could anticipate it, maybe pushing the country in a direction that no one could foresee, which is things were happening very quickly, and then of course we know what happened in the years thereafter, that the country is on the verge of collapse, while documenting people talking about it. That's when the podcast took off. It was really October 2019.
Yeah, a lot of focus came back onto Lebanon.
Yeah.
It was, a lot of people, I'm one of them. I was in the middle of making my documentary and came back, but I was one of those people around the world who wanted the Lebanese to sort of do something, wake up and take action. They knew everything, but they wouldn't take action. So the revolution united Lebanese all over the world. We were there completely in support of those here, and wanted the end of corruption and the hardships that oppression and theft and fraud had brought to the country. But unfortunately, we saw the collapse of the economic system, and we're not out of it yet. 2024, 4 years later. Country's still suffering, sadly, and the people are trying to deal with the economic hardship. I've never, in my years, since '88 was my first trip, in the years I've never seen Lebanese people begging, impoverished, and the last few years, very, very difficult to see it. Old men and women on the street asking for help to buy medicine or something. It's really heartbreaking. But let's go into your family background and really about your father, because he was a former US ambassador from Lebanon to, and he posted in DC, but also a former finance minister. And and he was in place in between 2009, 10, 11, 12, 13. I think he was assassinated. in 2013, is that right?
That's right. He was an advisor to two governments, the Senora government of 2005 to 2008,
Right.
and then he became an advisor to the Hariri government, and that included Hariri's exit too. So he stayed in the country until 2013 without a portfolio. This was an advisory position with a former prime minister who had not returned yet in 2016. He was assassinated December 27, 2013. What I like to do for the podcast is include a photo of him in his prime, and that's, I think, in his late 20s. So I like celebrating him my way.
Yeah.
I think Lebanese politics-focused crowd would know him better that way in his later years. And that's a photo taken a few weeks before his death. And I've included a few photos that I like, which is the crowd he was speaking to months before he died. And there's many more photos I have that I just keep in private. I'll try to frame him in a way that would make sense. My curiosity in Lebanon and Lebanese politics and Lebanese history has absolutely nothing to do with him. And there's a presumption that I am in this against my will. I was already in this. And what happened to him is clearly defined many things in my life since, but it's not where the passion comes from. It comes before. Now, whether that's instilled by him or not, I don't know. It probably is. And I think something when you're a kid, when you're a child, you don't choose your home. You don't choose where you're living, or you don't choose who you're visiting. Probably his insistence on coming here even in times of pain, civil war, and his deliberate decision to leave a career in the States and come back, and that happened more than one time, I think that definitely shaped the passion for this country. But I was already invested, and then this happened, and it took things to a place of silence. I chose to be silent for about 4 years. And there was a 4-year gap that I didn't set foot in this country. I left, actually. I left thinking that I would never come back after this happened. Of course, that wasn't true. And I think maybe I knew that I was lying to myself, but I was pretty sure that I needed to run away for a bit. 4 years later, all I could think about was coming back. And when I came back, I resumed these tours. The difference was everyone knew me without me realizing it. I left as soon as the cameras and microphones were on me, and I departed. 4 years later, I announced one tour, and without me even making any effort, 200 people had signed up. Maybe within the hour, I'm like, what have I done? Okay, I have to do a few more tours. They were all filled up. It took me time to realize that there's a celebrity status in this country which is strange. Politics is celebrity here, and it's not a good thing. And I didn't realize that I got some of that without me really appreciating it. And then I thought, okay, this is an opportunity for me to stop being silent. I'll talk about him, but my way. So I used to talk about him on the tour my way, where he's buried in Martyrs Square. So it's easy for me to talk about him at a stop I already knew by heart. But that was, without me realizing it, there's no going back from that. Because then suddenly you're being interviewed by everybody. Then the New York Times wants to do a piece on you. Al-Arabiya did a feature on me without me realizing it was for Al-Arabiya. I understood that it was going to be a clip. It ended up being a full report. And then Reuters did something about me too. I was like, oh, this is not, you can't come back from this. But I only wanted to talk about...
Can't go back into hiding, no. You're known now.
You're known. And you're already known without realizing it, but now you're a commodity. People can talk to you and they want your opinion. And I didn't feel qualified, actually. So I decided to talk about my father my way, which was limited. 2019, being on the streets, seeing politics really take off. I don't think anyone had bad intentions, not that. But I saw holes in the story. And I thought maybe I could play a role in at least filling some of those holes the best way I understand them. And I'm up for the challenge. And that's where a lot of these debates that happened were on the podcast. And I became that voice. Now, I don't know what that voice is, but it's
But it resonated with people because they, responded to you.
I think what I was doing was taking my father's last words and building on them in a way that I understood. And 7-8 years later, that's what it's become. It's keeping a voice alive, but adding to it. And also I grew more confident in celebrating him. I was very shy to do that at the beginning.
Did you agree with his politics?
There are certain conclusions I think he shared that did not impress me until later. So I think I've grown to better appreciate his final opinions and his own interjections with time. I think a lot of them have been proven accurate. But of course, as a son of somebody in politics, we would argue all the time. But they were good-spirited arguments.
Yeah.
I didn't always agree with what he was saying. I don't think he necessarily agreed with everything that was happening, but he was aware.
He's a politician. You can't...
But no. See, that's where... this is something else. Politician, he never ran for elections, and his role as a finance minister, and I know this because I remember that phase well, was him being so not interested and saying no until the decision was almost forced on him. Then that 8-month window between 2008 and 2009, 8 to 9 month window, was a position I know that he did not enjoy, being a finance minister. And I think that maybe anyone in that position, if they're well-intentioned, they're going to see so many bad things in the country. And that's a unique portfolio.
Yeah.
And that everyone is there. But his political role, I don't think he was a politician. I think he was a thinker and maybe a strategist, especially in his last years. The word here is, I think, used casually. Politician is, I think that doesn't, for me...
Doesn't really capture what he really stood for, what he was doing.
He's an economist by training, but he was also, I think, I'll give you just a final word. I think he was a diplomat without being a diplomat. He was an ambassador, but that's a long time ago. I think he was a diplomat among Lebanese parties and a diplomat to visitors, trying to change certain things, and of course those things didn't change.
It's a hard thing to do. Change Lebanon. Many have tried, but we haven't found enough of a strong collective or large enough collective to do it. But there have been some great individuals who've really stood out in history. I'm sorry if it might be a sensitive topic, but
it was a long time ago.
Yeah.
Now it's unfortunately it's something I grew accustomed to. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we know the history and that Hezbollah and Syria and the connections, and they've been tarnished, and rightly so, from my understanding of the history, with the assassinations of many key figures, including Samir al-Assir and Gibran Twaini. And is that the conclusion that regarding your father's assassination as well? Do you believe it was a cocktail of those two forces? We know that Syria always gives the orders, and it's ground men are Hezbollah.
You're absolutely right. There are a long list of crimes, especially political crimes, or at least not. You said it at the beginning. You're right. Even in these difficult times, petty theft and petty crimes are not common. Even when they sometimes catch us off guard, we're used to the more tragic, violent, national-like court blast tragedies than we are thieves, pocket thieves. Where is my wallet? Oh, it's there. Okay. Did you take my wallet? Did your producer? No, I'm kidding. The crimes we're adjusted to are car bombings or port blast ammonium nitrate explosions or missiles, right? I mean, we remember, unfortunately, we know what it's like to have, for a very long time, the young generation sometimes, they surprise me. They don't know what a sonic boom sounds like. I know this for my whole life. And then I realized, they've stopped for a long time. But in the 1990s, sonic booms were almost a daily occurrence. No country should be going through this on a daily basis. And of course, the news that we're watching right now, the brink of regional war, these are not normal things. What happened to that list of political figures, and I'll borrow the word here, political, just to sum them up in general, even though Samir Asir to me is also not a politician. But and Gibran Twaini,
they're key figures.
They're
important figures in the history of Lebanon.
Yes, you're absolutely right. What brings them together in the 2005 until today, the last 2 decades, what ties them together, I think, is trying to end, in their respective ways, the civil war, which means taking things back to where the state had full control. Now, you're right, the 1960s are great compared to today, absolutely. And maybe the 1960s to Lebanese then were problematic. Maybe they sensed danger on the horizon. Trying to take it back to a place that you can work from and build from, I think, is 1969. That's the last time the Lebanese state could handle its most important affairs. The collateral damage in the last 56 years, 55 years, has led to an unrecognizable Lebanon. And you're absolutely right in terms of corruption and collapse. Makes no sense. This country is a really bad, rotten version of itself. But the starting point, I think, is not 2019, or for that matter, 2005. 2005 to me was reclaiming something post-Syrian withdrawal and post-Syrian occupation, which started in the 1970s. In their way. It wasn't officiated, it wasn't official really until the 90s. But I think all of them are trying to they're trying to navigate the breakdown of Lebanon in 1970 and take it to somewhere that's governable. And post-Syria withdrawal in the last 19 years, 18 years, with the Syrians exiting and leaving their security agencies, taking them back to Syria, those key portfolios have been inherited. And those key portfolios that we accuse the Syrians of manipulating were fully inherited by Hezbollah. The documentation every person deserves, a court, a hearing, you see your criminals arrested, not one assassination, with the exception of Rafiq Hariri, has had any evidence. And I think a lot of us talk about the port blast in the same lexicon, in that you need an investigation. You want documentation, you want to know what happened and who did it. I really think the most underappreciated adventure has been the special tribunal. And it's underappreciated because it's not an emotionally rewarding moment. It happened in... It was supposed to happen in
2020. Yeah. It's just before, it was supposed to happen just before the explosion.
Right, and then...
They postponed it.
Or no, just after the port blast.
They announced it after.
Yeah, right. So let's say that's almost 15 years of waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting. It's fine. The answers were given. And that is something that I think a lot of these victims, in their own way, have sort of internalized, which is a price that we all have paid in the last 18 years is not really appreciating how dangerous Hezbollah has become to Lebanon. And all these people that paid a price in their own way crossed a security line with Hezbollah, not an expression line, not a popularity line, not a freedom line, not even, for that matter, amplification line. A lot of people scream and shout about this group every single day. I think that's not the war. The war is security. And Hezbollah inherited Syria's security apparatuses over time. And of course, when I say Hezbollah, I don't mean Lebanese citizens living in Dahi under the threat of Israeli bombing. Not that. Not even the Hezbollah voters. I'm not talking about Lebanese population that votes a certain way or doesn't vote. That's not my concern. Lebanese can do many things. And if you choose your year, they'll surprise you what they can do. And if it's during war, they behave also in ways that are unthinkable. I'm not talking about citizens or people. I'm talking about Iran's proxy paramilitary force, which is very, very important to Iran. That's the machine no Lebanese politician, thinker, journalist, whatever, that once they enter that or cross a line that is clearly military, you get on their radar. And how long it is before you get killed, I think that's up to them to decide. None of these people fight back. There's no opponent in terms of security. There's a political opponent.
But you've got to say something, right? I mean, when I look back at what, Gibran Twaini, Rafiq Hariri, Samir Asir, the main players that I've looked at, they've always had just said something which basically implied that we're sick of, Syria needs to get out of Lebanon now. Lebanon needs to be a sovereign nation, and basically words to those effect. And Rafiq Hariri, came in 92 and with the blessing and did deals and did everything. It wasn't clean, it wasn't pure, but then he woke up to the true depth and extent of the Syrian, octopus hands throughout the entire society and how it was bringing the country down, and demanded.
He's a prime minister under Syrian occupation, and that's clearly a negotiation of economic leverage versus security. And it's clear that he took the economic story, or at least inherited what he could, and left the Syrians alone in other things. That's a negotiation, I think.
Until he didn't. And then as soon as he didn't,
yeah,
that was it.
As somebody who has no insight into how Hezbollah makes their final decisions on when to kill and what...
It's Syria, it's not Hezbollah. It's Syria gives the word and they just execute on the ground.
In the 90s, absolutely. In the early 2000s, Syria's heavy hand in every single... you can definitely safely assume the Syrians are involved. The security role, at least in terms of Hariri's assassination, is Hezbollah.
Yeah, of course. To spend billions of dollars on that tribunal, which Saad Hariri and the family did, to come to that conclusion. And he was very disappointed, as we saw, but it was a political decision. It was a political decision because there was no other way out. It's
a choice between having an investigation with a conclusion or not. That's the only one that's happened. At least in terms of the stepping stone, which is giving the Lebanese government the authority to make arrests, that the Lebanese government doesn't, and that the Lebanese government ignores it, says more about Hezbollah's increased role rather than the government itself. Hezbollah in the 80s and Hezbollah today, we don't talk about it the same way.
No.
Even the Syrian regime, we don't talk about it the same way today. Or any of these groups that had a military role in the civil war, they're different versions of themselves. But what is clear, at least the way I see it, is that Hezbollah emerged into something that's more security and foreign policy and defense oriented than just a traditional Lebanese militia.
Of course.
That's where I think a lot of these, if not all of these assassinations in the last 20 years have shown how dangerous it is to get involved in those security affairs. But you're right, most of these people at least had a final word. You're right. And it happens to be my father's are on Twitter minutes before he dies. I think it's almost Hollywood-esque. That his last post minutes before he dies in his car, right before the car bombing, is about that group inheriting Syria's security and foreign policy, and then he's dead. That's minutes before. That thumb pushes post, minutes later he's gone.
But they'd planned it well before.
Absolutely, and Samir Asir was probably on their radar, not in June 2005, but probably in April and May. And what he was trying to get Syrians to do against Bashar is very important, and it's almost a footnote in history today. Or for that matter, you're absolutely right, Rafiq Hariri in 2003, 4, and 5 is much louder and more aggressive, and sending people to anti-Syrian meetings in the mountains. He joins Ibn Shahwan. Actually, it's with a friend of mine, Basil Flayhan, who dies a month after Rafiq Hariri, was in the convoy with him. He sends his advisor, a Protestant from Ras Beirut, to go meet opposition figures in Ibn Shahwan. He's a quiet anti-Syrian figure in the 90s. Rafiq Hariri was not taking risks. But I'll tell you a story from the embassy. Rafiq Hariri and the foreign minister, Faris Bouayiz, back then, were at odds on how to approach Syria as the Israelis were planning their withdrawal. So this is 99, 2000. And they had announced their intention to withdraw already. It was the Syrian government back then that was really worried about losing their occupation in Lebanon post-Israeli withdrawal. And this, trying to get Rafiq Hariri and Faris Bouayiz on the same page was impossible. So there was difficulty already in the 90s over what to do with Syria. But it doesn't take off really until 2004, 2005. And he's not the first. Marwan Ahmadi was supposed to die in 2004. He survived. 2 months later, 3 months later, Basil Flayhan and Rafiq Hariri are dead.
Interesting.
I've spoken too much.
Interesting. There's so much. It's like a hornet's nest, you know, you just can't get out of it. But we've got so much to talk about.
Queen bee.
No, we just want to talk about so much more. But yeah, it's indicative and very synonymous with Lebanon. Political assassinations, sadly, one of the worst.
We hope you're enjoying this latest podcast and just wanted to remind you to subscribe to my YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. And if you believe our work is worthy, then please support independent journalism and free speech by clicking on the button below and giving whatever you can afford. Thanks again. Now let's get back to the podcast.
Let's move to today.
Sure.
Let's come into the conversation that we're having with everyone at the moment. We spent a few days on the streets talking to people, general, whatever, about the imminent threat of full-scale war that Lebanon is facing, and looking at from where we were in the civil war, the bevy of militias that we witnessed, to the current situation where we have a Lebanese army and we have Hezbollah and with its militia. So it's very clear from what you've already just explained that you're not a fan, let's say. You're not a Hezbollah fan. Do you have an alternate opinion, or what do you say though to their decision on October 8 to engage Israel in support of the Palestinians?
And I think the word militia undersells what they do. Militia to me is what a group in the 1980s does with their ragtag, drug-induced checkpoints and security taxes and intimidation and fear on the checkpoints with your ID. I think Hezbollah is not a militia only. And that's because even, I think it's today, they're in a psychological warfare, sharing very, very sophisticated tunnel-like footage of what they can do. These tunnels that they can build across the country, and also geography that's not assumed only to be in certain areas, that they can operate the way a army operates, and they have the funding for it, and they're sophisticated paramilitary force that they can take on one of the strongest opponents in the world, and they can fight. Militia to me is a group that just runs away and hides. I don't think that's what they are. So this very, very powerful Iranian-funded paramilitary force that has intelligence, telecoms, security, terrorists, and also foot soldiers. They have all of the above. I think what they've been able to do, and the decision-making process they have made since October 8 has absolutely nothing to do with Lebanon, period. Now, That heavy, bold sentence to the side. The emotional reaction that we all feel, whether it's Palestinians getting killed, which has, I think, dominated the world in the last 10, 11 months, over 40,000 Palestinians dead in Gaza, is already unthinkable. But it's happened. The emotional reaction to seeing what's happening too, and this is a different time that we can see it in real time.
Yeah.
Unlike earlier wars, we now have Instagram feeds with almost celebrity-like. The eyes of Palestinians showing us what's happening is so tragic, but at the same time it hits us very hard. And add to that, since October 8, Lebanese civilians dying in the south.
Yeah.
And in addition to Lebanese civilians dying, destruction, villages getting destroyed.
Yeah.
And what it seems like the Israelis are doing, which is creating a de facto buffer zone that's uninhabitable. In the last few months, it's something like 3 to 5 kilometers of the border. For a very long time, will be difficult to live in through phosphorus or any other means. That, seeing what's happening and seeing it happen here, can create an emotional response that all of us, I think, feel in different ways. And also, obviously, Palestine is not a different planet. Palestine is here. Palestinians are here. Lebanese and Palestinians intermingle by default. Samir Asir is half Palestinian, for example, and he's Lebanese too. The reaction is legitimate. The emotional outrage, I think, even if you go to Australia or Iceland, you'll find people protesting what's happening.
Definitely.
So that's all true. None of that has to do with what Hezbollah is doing. There's not one emotional reaction happening since October 8. These are security decisions, and this is leverage, and this is engaging in a regional war, or even necessarily inviting the potential for an Israeli attack that is far more important to what Iran needs in the region than what any Lebanese needs right now. I don't see the two as the same.
I mean, definitely what you're, expressing, there's legitimacy to it, and a lot of Lebanon is very divided on this topic, very divided. You've got people who say it's none of our business. We feel compassion and sorrow and empathy for the Palestinians, but Hezbollah ain't going to solve the problem by shooting rockets in there. And then you have people who argue that yes, we had to. Who else is coming to the aid of the Palestinians and watching the traumatic tragedy that has befallen them since October 8? There's also another sector that says, well, they're coming after us. They're going to come after us after they're finished with Gaza. They've invaded us before, they've attacked us before, and this is us showing a strong defense. And
I've heard deterrence used too. Deterrence.
Deterrent,
yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a deterrent. Look, the impact on the South, the impact on the people, the ability of the Israelis to pinpoint and kill, commanders in Dahia and driving along, and yet they want to cause as much destruction and mayhem because they want the people to rise up against Hezbollah. It's really hard. I understand why there is a division, why people are divided. There's people who believe that they're so pissed off and angry and witnessed and experienced the torture and the horrendous impact of the Israelis when they were here, 82 to 2000 and 2006 war, they've seen it. So there's this in the nervous system that people just say, no, we've got to combat them immediately. So, that's the reality that we're finding and I'm seeing, and I'm torn as well. But I can't sit around and watch what's happening to the Palestinians. And if you leave it to the United Nations and the EU and all of these institutions, ICC, ICJ, what are we waiting for? It's just unconscionable.
Yeah.
But it's like you wish that the whole of the Arab world stood together and just set the consequences for America and Israel and said enough. But there's no consequences, and so it doesn't justify Hezbollah. This is a dilemma. This is a confusion that you go into because you're seeing something that should never have been allowed to last this long, and it continues.
With your permission, I'll just add a few things here. On October 8th, we'd already learned what had happened in Gaza, and the Hamas, the whole event had already reached our newsfeed. Less than 24 hours later, we learned that Hezbollah has launched rockets. Launched rockets near the Sheba farms, and I think they were military targets, deliberately chosen military targets. And the post-October 8 engagement has been mostly cautious tit-for-tat military engagement for the most part.
Compared to the Israeli attacks.
Right. I say cautious not in terms of discrediting the damage, not that. Cautious in that there's been no serious risk in terms of the Israelis invading Lebanon. But these attacks have been calibrated. With the maybe rare exception of one mistake in 10 months, which is a rocket into Majd al-Shams killing kids on a playground or whatever, playing football.
Which they denied. And why would they deny when everything else has been like, they could have said, sorry, it was a stray.
Without being a Hezbollah expert, I'll assume that's because of the blowback here. That the last time this happened was in the south with Druze villagers. The rockets that were being transported from village to village. This is before October last year. That the ambush against that Hezbollah truck by Druze villagers was de-escalated by Jumblat and others. I'm going to just guess they don't want to invite local chaos into what they're doing, where they're doing, more than apologizing. This is just speculation. Kahali happened last year too, when Hezbollah was sending weapons to Hamas via the Beirut Damascus highway, and people shot each other. A few people died too. The army gets involved as well. That has the threat of anarchy. I think they're avoiding that. And this actually, I think, is what drives Hezbollah. This is not a Lebanese militia behaving like Lebanese militia. This is a paramilitary project, seeking security and stability on their terms, and engaging in war in ways that maybe benefit Iran and have nothing to do with Lebanese concerns one bit, with the exception of ensuring that Hezbollah is part of the discussion and that Iran is brought into the equation. And I sense that the goal is to have a ceasefire that helps Iran. Hezbollah is strategic and it's security oriented. It's not trying to lose Lebanon. It's trying to help Iran. You go back in time, a regional war that happened in the middle of Lebanon's best years, 1967. June 1967, most of the conflict we talk about today goes back to that war. The Golan Heights, Majd al-Shams, occupied then annexed by Israel. That should be Syria. The West Bank and East Jerusalem is Jordan until 1967. You and me could have visited Jerusalem in 1966. A flight from Beirut to very close to Ramallah. Middle East Airlines flew to Jerusalem. We could go spend the weekend in Jerusalem. Jordan loses the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Egypt loses Gaza. Egypt loses what we're talking about today and the Sinai Peninsula. So there you have an Israel that grows threefold and a regional war that lasts a few days. It's referred to as a 6-day war.
That's right.
And every single Arab regime and their army are defeated in a humiliating loss. And even Abdel Nasser dies a few years later, humiliated and defeated. And not the Abdel Nasser of the 50s. He's weak, he's old, and he's dead. That whole war is discussed in textbooks and history books and classrooms and Arab-Israeli conflict discussions, and everyone refers to that war always. And I always found it curious. Lebanon is not brought up.
We didn't get involved.
We didn't get involved. To me, that's the recipe. That's the winning recipe. There's no reason this country should pay a price. And I think we're very lucky that we still have a country called Lebanon. But in 1967, the country did not collapse. It could have. It didn't. I would rather have that form of distancing from regional war than a paramilitary group that gets engaged on its terms.
I'm with you 100%. I mean, Hezbollah shouldn't be carrying arms. It should be the Lebanese army. But, you know, we're looking at the reality right now where if we do end up in a full-scale war with Israel, is the Lebanese army even possibly capable, ready to engage? What have they got? What equipment?
Yeah.
What technology?
No
What have
army
they got?
except for Israel, including the militias and proxies, can defeat Israel on the battlefield. And I think this is my bet. Maybe people feel otherwise because of the carnage. That the battlefield determined Israel. And the battlefield determined an occupied Palestine. And the battlefield has harmed, I think, us, Syria, Iraq, Egypt, Jordan, Palestine, and sometimes the Israelis feel what it's like October 7. They feel injury too. But that said, the battlefield to me is a losing cause, and I don't think Palestine will emerge through war. Israel emerged through war. I think diplomacy, even if it's unpopular, is the only way.
100%.
And we're both old enough, young enough, to remember the hope, even if it was scrutinized to death, even if it was not a great deal for the Palestinians then, or Arafat. We remember the hope of the 1990s.
The Oslo Accords.
Yes, Oslo, and also those moments of handshakes that we thought
Yeah,
was...
I was there. I covered the peace treaty signing between Israel and Jordan. You know, I was there. I admit I've been to Israel to cover it as a journalist, Australian journalist, but the Israelis were like, oh my God, could this really be peace?
Right.
They wanted peace. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, they suffered just as much, but they were a different breed of Israeli to the Israeli 100%. There is today. They were like, you know, they had the weight of those many decades, and also the spate of that period when they had the restaurant and nightclub bombings. You know, it went on for years. They were just done. But I know we all want diplomatic solutions.
I remember Clinton
but
flying
Israel
into
doesn't.
Gaza.
Israel doesn't.
You are absolutely right. You are absolutely right. The Israelis have not been pushed to accept a real, satisfying deal that ends this war. You're right. And that to me is not a reason to abandon diplomacy.
No,
that's
we're
a
not.
reason. And if I may add a bit of sugar to maybe sweeten the deal a bit, I think that should be Lebanon's role. It's not Hezbollah, but reminding the Americans or anyone with leverage against Israel to be doing that. That is a Lebanon I would be proud of. Imagine our foreign minister insisting that the Americans listen to what he said, not just regurgitating Hezbollah talking points.
We don't have anyone with any decency and respect in the government today that anyone would want to actually pay any attention to.
Right.
And that's a problem with, you're right, I mean, it's the role of Lebanon. Look, Charles Malik was one of the founders and writers of the UN Charter with Roosevelt, with Eleanor Roosevelt. You know, she handed it over to him.
Human Rights Declaration is Lebanon's part of it.
Exactly. I mean, we have a long history in this, and Lebanon was the gateway. It was where the East met West. But unfortunately, the last 5 decades.
No, I will disagree with you politely. Very politely, I will insist on a slight disagreement. 2006 is good for Lebanon because Lebanon was involved. Not what happened, not the tragedy, not the 2,000 Lebanese.
The government.
The government was actually battling two things at once: Iran's interests and Israel's war. And the Lebanese government did the right thing. We had a foreign minister, Tariq Mitri, an acting foreign minister at the time, at the UN, shouting against the Israeli ambassador to the UN, shouting the right words and defending Lebanon, not defending Hezbollah or Iran, defending Lebanon. That same acting foreign minister and that government then insisted on a resolution that wasn't Chapter 7. 1701 is a Chapter 6 resolution because Chapter 7 meant Hezbollah would not accept. And Chapter 6 was the best they could get without getting Hezbollah to say no. That's a government I can respect in times of war. It's not trying to hurt Hezbollah. It's trying to find a path forward
for the nation
that doesn't destroy Lebanon. What we're seeing right now is an impotent government
totally.
that just is a shadow reflection of what Hezbollah needs. That's not diplomacy.
No.
But I would like a Lebanon that is vocal in ending the Arab-Israeli conflict.
I would love a Lebanon that way. Yeah, we have the people. They're not in power because they're not of that mindset and value set of the people that lead the country now. This
is the slow, corrosive, collateral damage that Hezbollah has done to government too. Not just the battlefield. Not just war. The way we expect nothing today in 2024 is the slow decay of what you have now, which is by and large pandering voices that survive even in times of war, or spare wheels that we have nothing to expect from, nothing to be proud of.
But that's not just the Hezbollah. That's not just about Hezbollah.
Yeah.
It's about a collection of leaders from different sects and factions who have one interest in mind, and that is their own vested personal interest, power, money, greed, and wanting to stay in power. And that's how they get to sit around the table, continue to sit around the table. From everything I've discovered, listened to, heard, they all share and bear responsibility. The reality is we're in the predicament that we're in today. Lebanon is where it is today because there are people from all the various main sects, whether they're Sunni, Shia, Maronite, Druze, you name it, sitting around that table and they're being handed down power or accepting power, moving into those positions. And when they may have, one or two may have come in with, idealistic viewpoints, but when they realised that what was going on, they didn't get out and scream and shout to the world and said, no, this is what's going on, we can't allow it to happen. They got bought into, well, you can, participate in this. And maybe there was a threat against their lives, but that's, hey, get the information out. That's your job. WikiLeaks it, man. Get it out there. That's why Julian Assange spent years in prison. He's got to get the information out. But that's their responsibility. They sign an oath to, serve the people of this nation. So I get frustrated when people always want to blame Hezbollah.
Yeah.
I'm just like, Hezbollah's won. If they all stood up against Hezbollah, there's no way Hezbollah can get away with what it's doing.
They have. And I'll tell you how.
How?
This is not meant to disagree. It's meant to, let's say we're painting the same picture and we have two different paintbrushes. They have in their Lebanese way. Not in a way that both of us would be impressed by, but they have in their Lebanese way. And you mentioned the sects. Let's go into them one by one. I remember a Michel Aoun, despite his hot temper, despite his very, very aggressive nature, I remember him hiding in the French embassy because he had lost a very critical war against the Syrian army, and he paid a price for it, which is 15 years abroad. That's probably the most important Lebanese Christian voice to emerge at the end of the civil war. A Lebanese army general who's hiding in his pajamas at night and running to the French embassy out of fear. Lebanese soldiers die as the Syrian army takes over Ba'abda. That Michel Aoun in 1989, who's against everything, against Ta'if, against Syria, against Hezbollah too. In Paris, his raison d'etre becomes Lebanon's sovereignty and Lebanon's independence. Michel Aoun, in 2020, and his last months as president of Lebanon, is Hezbollah's preferred president, Lebanon's perhaps worst president, and a man in retirement now in Rabieh who doesn't say a word. The inheritor is exactly what Hezbollah would like in a Lebanese communal leader, a man who focuses on economy and Batroun and leaves everything else to that group. That's Gibran Bassil. That's the Maronite. The Chatah experience, which we know in different ways, his threat, let's say, not to Michel Aoun, to Syria, and 11 years we didn't hear about him. The Lebanese forces is de facto illegal in terms of political presence in Lebanon, and Samir Chatah disappears for 11 years. That's not a footnote, I think, in Lebanese history. That's somebody who challenges Syria's order in Lebanon and then has to emerge from that post-March 14. He's let out, if I'm not mistaken, in June or July of 2005. Chatah, long-term, I think, and we can get back to him later if you'd like, is clearly somebody who's not able to do more than he does in terms of confronting this security climate. And Chatah, to me, reflects, in a way, the de facto consequence of Lebanese politics today, which is that if you're going to have a presence in Lebanon, politically, you're going to have to work with uncomfortable people and sometimes form an alliance when necessary. And even these people that we scream and shout against regularly, there's not more he can do anyway.
I'm talking about the people today, the people in the last 10 years.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the last, you know what, I'll make it easier. The Sunni experience, we said it before, Rafiq Hariri is not alive for the reasons we discussed. You end up with Hezbollah's preferred prime minister, a communally legitimate Sunni leader who spends the better part of some 15 years proving time and again through exile, whether it's temporary or long-term, that every time he makes a certain decision against Hezbollah, or his crowd does, let's say his team, there's either the threat of war or there's real war. And 2008 is not long ago, where the Lebanese government, he's not prime minister then, Fouad Siniora is, the Lebanese government tries and fails at circumventing Hezbollah telecoms and airport security. There's a bloodbath as a result. That's Sunni leadership. And now we don't talk about Saad Hariri, and that's because the man ended his political career in failure. Sunni leadership, gone. Shia.
I'm going to cut you here because the thing is, I understand where we're going with all of these people, but when you talk to me or say, bring up people like Hariri and Bassil and Nabi Berri and whatever, and whilst I honestly got the feeling in my interview with Hariri that he really wanted to end the corruption, but when you think about, when you do the research, they talk the talk, but they still had all the contracts. They can't sit here and set themselves on this morally high, uprighteous stance and say, I'm going to bring an end to Hezbollah, when he's got contracts for whether it's the waste management or the construction or whatever it is. They're all in the hands of a select group of people and their cronies, the Lebanese reconstruction, whatever it's called, the people...
CDR.
Yeah. Do you look at the names in there? You look at the companies in there. They're all owned by this group of people and their friends. Riyad Salami's in there telling me amazing things about the banking system when I interviewed him. And the guy becomes one of the most, prolific. I'm just saying that they may appear to have tried, and this is what Gibran Bassil says too, and all of Tayyar, we are the only ones. I can't believe that there are people still who believe that they're so innocent and so uprighteous, and they haven't
Sorry, I'll try to summarize. Not what they're trying to sell you, which is that they're better than the rest. I'm trying to show something that I think has impacted every community. And the reason I wanted to talk about the communities is that communal leadership is essential to Hezbollah too. The corruption that happens after, I feel more and more that's the long-term collateral damage to this system of governance that Hezbollah insists on preserving in a way that suits them only. I think of corruption as the most severe individual punishment we all face. And there's no excuse for it. Anyone that's engaged in corruption in Lebanon doesn't deserve a pass. But Nabih Berri succeeds Musa Sadr, killed,
Assassinated
in 1978 or 78, late 70s. Nabih Berri is not a Hezbollah ally. There's only one militia that has Hezbollah blood on their hands in Lebanon. That's Amal.
Yeah.
For 2 years.
Yeah.
All these terrible Harab al-Mukhayyamat. Palestinians died too. But Hezbollah and Amal shooting at each other in Beirut and across the country. These horrible videos of Amal fighters calling Hezbollah fighters Hizb Did Allah and then shooting at them. And Palestinians are paying the price too. Nabih Berri becomes the solid ally Hezbollah needs. There's no sensible alternative. There's a pandering ally who's small and marginal but retains one portfolio for 32 years. I can't think of Nabih Berri doing different, or for that matter, someone more sensible taking his place with that problem in our lives.
Just there's so much that we can delve into, but the last question I want to bring up about Hezbollah, is this now the time we should be talking about Hezbollah and arguing internally when the threat of war, and we have witnessed the enemy at our doorstep above our heads? It's an internal domestic issue that needs to be dealt with. But right now, Lebanon needs to, and if it was wise, and going back to what the wisdom of those leaders of the 1960s and 50s would have done, they would have united as a nation, stood together and dealt with the imminent threat first, and then come back to deal with Hezbollah or the internal issue. That is where I sit on this. I did interview the general recently. He's saying that the time is not right. What is your view on that? What do you think?
Well, one could argue the time has not been right to talk about anything that we've talked about too. I think timing, unfortunately, is not on our side, even on a good day in Lebanon. All of these subjects, I think, are sensitive, and they can be dismissed for having no output to. I share the bleakness in that, in terms of emotional outpouring, it's difficult to send the right message when there's a war happening, and you maybe potentially end up losing the size of the audience without realizing it. They don't want to hear this when there's war. This could all be true, and it probably is true on social media. I've seen a shift in how people engage social media in the last few months, and there's real animosity to bringing up Hezbollah from a side that I think doesn't want war. They're not the anti-Hezbollah crowd.
No.
Right. So I sympathize with the emotion. But I still think in times of carnage, talking to find solutions is far more constructive than silence. Constructive dialogue, I think, includes two things. Not blaming Lebanese. I don't have the stomach for sectarian discourse that makes Lebanese Christians seem like they're monolith, or Lebanese Shia, as that these are all a bunch of Hezbollah supporters. I don't care if they are. They're still here, and they're Lebanese. They're, for me, a sympathetic audience, not an opponent. But I know, if you're living in Mount Lebanon in the 1980s, it's impossible to ask Lebanese in certain parts of the country to push the Lebanese forces out. You end up at war. Lebanese Shia, to me, are as malleable and imperfect as any other Lebanese group. 1970s, old women are throwing rice on the southern border as the Israelis come in to hit Arafat. Maybe those women's children and grandchildren are shooting at Israel. 3 generations can be doing opposite things. I don't blame people. So constructive dialogue to me, it's not about hating Lebanese, it's about getting Iran out of Lebanon's security, defense, and foreign policy so that these discussions can end. We should have a Lebanese state that monitors its borders and makes sure, in my opinion at least, that Lebanon doesn't pay a price when there's a war happening next door. I don't think we deserve it. I don't think we should be opening our borders to regional war. Something I believe in. I don't think emotions should be channeled to including Lebanon in more war. I fundamentally believe we should be sparing the country from regional war.
Right. Well, let's move on then, shall we? Just bringing it back to today and looking at Hezbollah again and looking at the militarization of some, as we mentioned, you said that there's thugs with weapons. They might not be military like the Hezbollah. And I'm sure you're absolutely right. I mean, Hezbollah proudly parades its 100,000 soldiers and officers and their weaponry. It's a show of force. But you know, Lebanese forces has their little parades as well, and it's quite eerie watching them. I get concerned because you see what happened in Tayuni a couple of years ago between Hezbollah and Lebanese forces, and they obviously had some heavy weapons in. And we've seen clashes during the elections in 2022. To me, there's more than Hezbollah that has weapons, but it's not, of course, to the same extent. But you know, Amal and their thugs that get out there are frightening as well. Where do you see those in the melee with Hezbollah?
I completely agree with you. There's a sizable group of Lebanese, and you mentioned several outfits that have, I don't know the sophisticated word, could be low-grade arms. Some of them have automatic weapons. Tayuni is one recent example of what can happen when there's a skirmish that leads to real chaos on the streets. And you're right, 2008, it's not just Hezbollah shooting. Hezbollah's opponents do have those low-grade arms, which I think has worsened in the last few years. Reminds me, I think, of what my father used to describe as the breakdown of Lebanon in the 1970s, where weapons were reaching places that were problematic. At a far lesser scale today than the 1970s, and in a less organized manner, without a coherent opposition to a paramilitary force. It seems like there's anarchy rather than civil war. But focusing on the Lebanese forces and how they operate and how they don't. And the military parades I've seen also extend sometimes to the SSNP, which are very small and very scattered, but those military parades are a big turnoff. Or when you have Jnud al-Rab showing up not with weapons but with intimidation and fists, that also scares me. Thuggery is a sign of breakdown to me. The Lebanese forces of the 1980s. I would sit with my grandmother in Tripoli, Lebanon, with her eyes focused on every single word Samir Jaja said. As a military militia commander and a man who was on LBC every single night when LBC first started, as Samir Jaja, who was fearful, who you knew what he was capable of doing, and even the name is intimidating. And Samir Jaja is not an angel. I don't care what their hardcore supporters say. This is not Nelson Mandela. You mentioned that they're the largest political outfit today in parliament. They're big. They have a political presence. He's definitely an above average militiaman in the 80s, above average in that he survived. But the Lebanese forces of my grandmother's eyes was one of fear and real worry that this can lead to darker times. My grandmother passed away 3 years ago.
Allah yarhamah.
Allah yarhamah. Those same beautiful eyes, watching, I think it's the same TV, in Tripoli, looking at Samir Jaja, and it's either of no concern to what her life is, what she's dealing with, or she's listening because she may be nodding her head in agreement. That's the man she was afraid of, and a man she probably loathed in the 80s, and in her last months, last days, he's just somebody she listens to without fear. And the fact that she can agree with the same man, maybe in her 80s, I think it's quite telling. Post-2005, I think of Samir Jaja's journey as the one I would want Hassan Nasrallah to end up in, meaning a loathed military commander, and a popular one, and a charismatic one perhaps, can end up being the head of a large bloc in parliament by winning elections and insisting, even when things are delicate and fragile, insisting that Tayoune doesn't turn into civil war, that Tayoune people go home. Samir Jaja is how I would like any Lebanese former militiaman to end up in boring Lebanese politics. And I don't think Hassan Nasrallah and Samir Jaja hold the same weight today.
No.
And I think maybe we also assume Hezbollah wants civil war. They don't. And a lot of this careful consideration is that Hezbollah, like any other Lebanese group or paramilitary group that once operated here, Fatah disappeared in 1982 from Lebanon. Hezbollah would lose a civil war. And I don't think Hezbollah can afford that kind of climate.
I'm going to close out this very fascinating discussion and discovery into your world and your mind, and just ask you finally, what's next? What are you doing next?
I don't think I'm a podcaster. I ended up in the podcasting space. I think that's just one of other things I will keep doing, which is my version of storytelling and my way of holding fact over fiction while trying to get the story right. And maybe I said the word earlier, but I think narrative is what's being chipped away at. And I don't think emotions should guide how people look back at this time. I think people need to remember that certain things maybe come out during times of chaos and war that are not entirely true. And that hopefully there's something left behind.
You probably don't realize what an important role you're playing historically, because documenting conversations, articulating the narrative of what you're witnessing right now, it goes into the history and the annals of Lebanon. And we don't have a government that's recording our history. And the only way is good people like you and I and others that are having these conversations, capturing them on video or on voice or somehow through the written form. But, we are the modern historians that people, hopefully, if they can find our stuff, if we're able to keep it, will have a source to go to. And, because we're not tied to anyone other than the truth and telling the stories, I think what we do is very, very important. I think that's part of our contribution, the best way we can to serve these people that we love so much, even though they frustrate the hell out of me sometimes. And this incredible country that deserves to be liberated and, just let be.
Yep.
So I commend you. I thank you for this opportunity, and that was a great conversation.
Thanks to you, Daizy.
Thank you, Ronnie.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.
We did it.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Real Talk and experiencing firsthand the real stories told by real people. I hope you found value and meaning, and encourage you to subscribe to my YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcasts. Your ongoing financial support is vital to our ability to continue delivering these stories, so please remember to click on the donate button in the description, giving only what you can afford. I spent my whole life giving my time, money and skill to serve human rights and social justice causes, and I know it's not easy to keep giving selflessly. But this work is important because the mainstream media has failed to live up to their obligations. So we need to step up, speak up, or we're no better than them. I believe by tuning in to this podcast, you are someone who wants to know the facts and the truth, so you can independently decide what to believe and what not to. My job is to deliver that information. Yours is to place a value on it. Whatever you decide is humbly welcome. Thanks again, and see you on the next episode of Real Talk.